If I could have everyone's attention for a moment, we're ready to begin with the conference for the lunch period. It's my pleasure to introduce Christopher Lingle, who's a visiting professor of economics at Universidad Francisco Marroquín here in Guatemala. The title of his conference is The Growth of Latin America Towards the Future. Made in China? It's a question. With your permission, I'll read from a short excerpt of his biography. As I said, Chris Lingle is a visiting professor of economics at Francisco Marroquín University. He earned his doctorate in economics from the University of Georgia in 1977, and since then he's been active in the academic circuit at universities in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the United States. Besides being visiting professor of economics at Francisco Marroquín, he's also an adjunct scholar at their Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia, a research scholar at the Center for Civil Society in New Delhi, and a member of the Academic Advisory Council of the Globalization Institute in Brussels. Dr. Lingle's research interests are in the areas of political economy and international economics. He focuses upon emerging market economies and public policy reform in Europe, East Asia, and Latin America and Southern Africa. His work has appeared as chapters in books, the international media, and scholarly journals. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause and welcome to Christopher Lingle. Thank you.
It's a great honor to be here. I want to thank the organizers, first of all, for the nice introduction, for Carolina for conspiring to bring me back based on some of my outrageous ideas that I express sometimes in the local media. It's wonderful to be here. I have a very firm attachment and great fondness for, in particular, Guatemala, but most especially to Universidad Francisco Marroquín, which is my intellectual and spiritual home. I'm not here all that much, but when I am, I thoroughly enjoy the fellowship and the wonderful intellectual environment there. And those who are visiting from other countries, I would like to recommend to you to try to visit the campus before you go. If you want to see what is undoubtedly, certainly the best university in Central America and one of the best in Latin America, and I would contend in all of the Americas. So it's a very interesting institution, and I'm very proud that they invite me back from time to time. So thank you, and I'm happy to be here. Now, I'm not as so much a China scholar as I am simply interested in the way the global economy works. China is one part of that picture, of course. I do spend much of the year somewhere in Asia, and part of it I'll be going to China again in July. So I'm not a specialist as such, but I do a lot of thinking about what goes on in China, and I try to get a lot of firsthand information by going there and visiting there. And so my brief then is to talk about how China might have a role in the future of Latin America. Now, I'll lay the punchline to the joke at the beginning, which I've never been able to tell jokes well, so I make that mistake. But my message is going to be for you is that the destiny of Latin America is in your hands, not in the hands of China. I'm going to recommend that you don't look to China necessarily for your success in the future or to create a dependency any more than you would choose to link yourself very tightly to America, which is, historically much of Latin America has held the gringo at arm's length. So I would suggest that you may want to consider rethinking China China's story needs to be rethought, I think, and this is part of what I'm going to do today. So much of what I will talk about is going to be more China and less Latin America, because you know much more about Latin America than I do, and I may know a little bit more about China than you do, but perhaps not. I know some of you that I've met in the audience have a great deal of exposure to China. My email address is there. If you would like to contact me, feel free, or I'll provide you with a business card. I'll be happy to provide you with the outline I've had prepared for you today. And I'd be happy to, be in touch with some of you. I've met some very interesting people here. And again, I applaud the organizers for putting together such a good group, especially these lovely ladies with their colorful outfits that have been so effective in keeping this program running. Thank you. I'll leave it to you to decide if there's any handsome boys. I haven't checked, but the girls are all quite lovely. So, okay. So let's take a bit of a look at China. Now, the Chinese believe that what's happening now is a restoration of the global order, because centuries ago, China and of course India as well, but the large Asian civilizations were dominant in terms of the global economy. And what we see is that China, if we go back not centuries, but not so far back to the mid-19th century, China constituted about a third of global GDP. It's very significant. But years of struggle with revolutions and warlords and then the ill-fated communism and Maoism that dragged the economy down. By the 1980s, it was only about 2% of the global GDP. And of course, now it's rising back towards about 15%. Now, what strikes people more vividly here is that China constitutes much of global economic growth. So the growth that we see in the world at large is driven in part by what's happening in China. China, 25% of every year, 25% of the annual growth can be attributed to what's happening in China. And so now, famously, China's become the world's #2 economy. Now, of course, it's eclipsed Japan in this regard. But to put that in perspective, China's per capita GDP is still very, very small. Much smaller than Japan's, clearly. Japan's GDP, per capita GDP, obviously ranks it as one of the richest countries in the world, never mind the size of the GDP per se. So sometimes when we talk about that China is so important, we lose track of the fact that in terms of per capita GDP, it's less significant in that regard. Now, it's interesting. I have this story that I tell people. I've always been very cautious about looking at China's future. And what I tell people, I say, I'm pessimistic about China's future when I'm out of China, and I become optimistic when I go there. Because any of you that have visited China would know very well how vibrant it is and if you, as I have, been going there for many years, could see dramatic changes, very impressive changes. But there is some underlying and structural problems in China that trouble me and have troubled me for years. The good news is I've been wrong up till now. But the bad news is the reason I was wrong is that I underestimated the grotesque stupidity of global central bankers and the incapacity of the Chinese leadership to really know what was going on. And for that, I'm sorry. I mean, the Chinese leadership are usually very astute, but they have, I tell people, I've been writing love letters to the Chinese leadership in Beijing for years. I write a lot of opinion articles, and they've never responded to them somehow. But I've been trying to explain to them what some of these problems are. And I'll discuss some of these a bit later. Okay, so China's share of global trade has gone up dramatically just in recent years. It's more than doubled since the early 2000. The share of global exports, in particular, have doubled in just about 10 years. The share of global imports, on the other hand, China is now the 6th largest importer, which is very significant. But of course, a lot of that are commodities. And it's now the 2nd largest with very dramatic growth. Now, Chinese companies, although they're except for Haier perhaps and Legend, there's virtually no well-known Chinese brand in the world. But these companies are growing. They're becoming more significant. The oil companies, in particular, telecoms as well. So we see that China's made great strides in that regard. Very impressive. Now, this is very interesting to me. There are various estimates for when China, most people, by most accounts, expect China to overtake the United States as having the largest GDP. Now, this, as an economist or as an American, doesn't trouble me one way or the other. More power to them if they can do it. For reasons I'll explain to you, I don't think it's going to happen. But let's look. The Economist of London says that it will happen by 2018 or later if the rate of economic growth dropped to as low as 5% from the current roughly 7.7%. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, says 2016, a little bit sooner. And the Chinese, in their inimitable sort of humility, they set it a little bit further out. They say 2020. But the consensus here is that China will undoubtedly and almost assuredly overtake the United States within 10 to 20 years. For reasons I'll explain, as I said, I'm not so confident. My little gadget's not working. There we go. Okay. Okay, so let's look at very briefly some of what's been going on between Latin America. Of course, we all know this visit over the last weeks into the Caribbean and Latin America with the Chinese trailing behind with bags of dollar bills to curry favor and to secure trade relations. Maybe the battery is not working in this. Could someone? Okay, well, it's sort of working. Okay, all right, sorry. This is a bad thing about PowerPoint. You get so absorbed with trying to make these things work. Okay, so what we've seen very substantial increases in the trade back and forth, obviously. It's gone up by 12 times to roughly $150 billion. China's importing much more than they were previously, but it's still not significant. Foreign direct investment flows, excluding the tax havens like the Cayman Islands and so on, have gone up by 6 times in a very short period of time. But this is still only roughly 1% of foreign direct investment. So although for a given country it may be significant, for a given project it might be do or die, but for Latin America as a whole, it's not such a big deal. Latin American foreign direct investment going the other way into China is about $100 billion. So it's a two-way street, but it's not such a big thing. And of course, there's some aid that comes in primarily based upon this sort of diplomatic contest between Taiwan and Taipei and Beijing, but that's also might be significant locally, but for the region, not so much. Now, one of the other stories, and this follows on the wonderful expose that preceded mine by Sergio, in understanding what will be in Latin America's future and how to secure Latin America's economic future. Now, China, as I will suggest to you, is only one piece of the puzzle. It may be a big one, or it may not be. It may be less big in the not-too-distant future than it has been as we see some retrenchments in China. Now, so in other words, we shouldn't focus so heavily on China, per se, as China being the way forward for the Latin America economies. Now, why not? Well, China, there are a lot of reasons to anticipate instability in China, both politically and economically, and I'm going to speak about those. The current leadership was handed what I would call a poisoned chalice. The previous leadership handed over power to them, and they are facing enormous challenges that have not been faced in the last 30 years. So there are some reasons, and again, I keep putting you off. I'll talk about these in a moment. Changing relative prices will impact on China. In particular, relative wage rates. China's wages are rising more rapidly than the wages are in other parts of Asia and indeed in parts of Latin America. So China's losing its relative sort of competitive strength. These are being weakened by local realities. So we'll see places like Mexico, and I think I'll speak a bit more about Mexico in a moment, that are going to gain from China some of those advantages and be able to okay. Another reason that you might not want, and I don't know how many people are here from countries that still recognize Taipei, but I think it's probably in your interest to keep playing that game as long as you can, as long as you can hold out. So that's just a personal observation. It's probably a good bidding war. Now, the point that was raised, I believe, in the earlier discussion, as I will reiterate here, is that your destiny is in your own hands. It's up to your policymakers to allow your countries to become richer, create more wealth, to escape the imposed siesta that Latin America has slumbered under. Latin America has been cheated of its destiny by poor governance, by poor political governance. And to understand that, you have to understand, why are people poor? Much of Latin America is made up of poor people. People are poor not because they don't have land, because in a modern economy, land is not what gives you wealth. People are poor because they don't have jobs, and therefore they don't have a steady income. Why do they not have jobs? They don't have jobs because there's insufficient capital accumulation and investment. Why is there insufficient capital accumulation and investment? Look around you. Government policies. I've told my students at Marroquín many times, I said, imagine if all of the capital owned by Chapin, just in the housing stock in Miami, was returned to this country. It would flourish. There's so much offshore capital in all these countries by good and decent people who are trying to escape from the financial repression or the theft or the waste and destruction of their wealth. So it resides offshore, making other people, and think about all the Hispanics that flee to America to make the gringos more comfortable and richer. We get some of the best people. We get the most energetic people that should be here creating wealth in your countries. And I lay the blame at the feet of political governance. And then this is part of the story that Sergio was saying earlier. So therefore, China's not your destiny. You have your destiny. You've got to make good political choices and implement these political choices that invite not foreign capital. This is one of the things people get. I've never really understood these arguments very well. People get so wrapped up in trying to attract foreign capital that they forget that the real story is you're supposed to make the place hospitable to domestic capital. And then foreign capital can come. This is what's important. It's because it's people like you, the entrepreneurs and businessmen, who are the creative forces that will drive these economies. It's not going to be China per se. China can help you with commodity sales and some business deals, but most of you will prosper on your own initiatives if you're allowed to, and that depends upon what the government policies are. So, and exports are even a mystery to me to a certain degree. Certainly exports are important, but what Adam Smith taught us in his great book, The Wealth of Nations, was that the primary benefit from trade internationally was from importing, not from exporting. Because if you import the cheapest and best commodities, goods, and services with a full range of qualitative differences, then your producers will be more competitive and they'll be able to export. That facilitates your export. The consumers will be wealthier. They'll be able to spend more buying domestic production. So this is the thing that Smith taught us, and that seems to be lost on so many. But imports are truly the most important element of international trade, not exports. Exports are, and also in a world of a gold standard, which of course the way it was when he developed the idea, by buying commodities from other people and goods and services, you provide them with the means to buy yours. So trade really depends very heavily on your openness to imports. Now, around Latin America, and China's famous for this as well, these so-called free trade zones, zona francas. These are a mystery to me. Now, why people think these are such a good idea. Now, consider the following. If governments decide to put in a free trade zone, this is a clear admission that their policies are creating such a heavy burden that the only way they can get anybody to come in is to make them exempt from some of these regulations or from some of these taxes. Why in the world would you do that for foreign companies, but not for your own? I mean, how does that pass the smell test? The idea is if once governments have admitted that they are screwing up with the policy, then the whole country should be a free trade zone. You don't have a select industry or foreigners only. What sense does that make? This has never been very clear to me. Now, so this is the way I see Latin America grasping its destiny in the future. Coming to understand that much of this sort of conventional understanding of the global economy is really based upon erroneous understandings of the market process. It's really mercantilism. Adam Smith drove a stake through the heart of mercantilism with his famous book. But it wasn't effective. It's like a zombie. It keeps coming back. And it comes back in different forms. It comes back in China and much of Asia as export-led development. This is just mercantilism under a new name. But it's just as corrupting, it's just as distorting, and it's just as problematic as it was in Smith's day. The only difference is we have democracies rather than monarchies. So, now, let's look at what some of the net benefits. So if China's not the only story, and not even the main story, let's look at how Latin America could benefit from globalization. Well, one way, and this is what I've written about a great deal, is what goes on in East Asia and Southeast Asia, in the so-called tigers and dragon economies. Now, if you look at a country like, well, city-state, like Singapore. Now, Singapore, roughly 70% of industrial production is owned by foreigners. So Singapore was blessed, in a way, by not being located, say, in the Caribbean, where it would have feared the gringo and kept out all this foreign investment. the Singaporeans don't care who owns the means of production, whether they're foreigners or domestic owners. They care if they have a good job and if they have high salaries. And they do have that because they've allowed substantial freedom for capital to come in and to go out of their country. So, well, something's not working here. Am I pushing the wrong button? No? Okay, well, get over gringophobia. I think everybody's trying to embrace China, but the gringos are there all along, and you reject them, for good or for bad. Why would you believe that China? I feel constrained. Why would you believe the Chinese are going to be a better partner necessarily than the gringos? I mean, so many of you know this. They don't leave much on the table. Well, translation. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So, the Chinese don't leave much on the table when you bargain with them. So, I don't know that the gringo's a better partner, but you're going to have to decide that on your own. But it seems to me, if you're going to embrace China, then you should be looking at any possibilities, not just the Chinese per se. Now, the embracing free trade and free flows of capital, and I wish in the United States they would accept more wholeheartedly the free flow of immigration into and out of the U.S. But I think your country should consider that as well. As I mentioned earlier, the whole point of all of this is that you make the environment hospitable not just to foreign capital, but to domestic capital. And that's really should be your focus. I didn't bring notes because I thought this was going to work. There we go. Okay. Policy initiatives to maximize the gains from globalization. Well, actually, a couple of years back, I was invited to give a briefing to your current president when he ran for office the first time. And this was the pitch I gave him. I said, I'm going to try to tell you how to win elections without being a populist, without relying on populism. So popular policies without populism, because under populism, you have to give away the store. You have to take away from somebody else to give to someone else, for the most part. So I tried to come up with ways to promote economic growth. I proposed policies including reduction of tariffs, which was discussed earlier, reducing restrictions on capital flows and so on. These sorts of things that can begin to show results. And in a country like Guatemala, I would also make the informal sector more secure. I mean, this would give you a great deal of credibility with a large voting bloc. But I won't get into all these details. But I think that you can construct policy programs that don't rely on populism, but that can be very popular. Attacking corruption, or a big problem in this country, trying to make the people's lives more secure. This will pay off. Was this meant to embarrass me? Oh, here we go. I'm doing it enough on my own. Okay. Evaluate the role and impact of international agencies and NGOs. If I became president of a Latin American country, the first thing I would do was inform the IMF, the Inter-American Bank, the World Bank, that they weren't welcome. They could close their offices and leave. I'd probably invite many of the NGOs to leave as well. It's my view that many of these organizations do enormous harm to your countries. The World Bank encourages